Brofidiau, welcome back to this second panel session this morning. As Martin said, I'm Michael Woods. I'm a Professor of Human Geography at Aberystwyth University, and I'm co-director of the Centre of Welsh Politics and Society at Aberystwyth, and also of WISAD, the Wales Institute of Social Economic Research and Data, which is a interdisciplinary centre linking social scientists across several Welsh universities. This session, as Martin said, is on learning from community experiences, envisaging future possibilities. And this is a topic which is certainly close to my long-standing research interests. I have, through my career, particularly worked with rural communities and tried to understand how they respond to change and challenges of many types. And I've done that through relational approaches, as we heard a little bit about in earlier sessions this morning. And from that kind of relational approach, one of my main arguments or drivers has been that communities are not just the victims in change. There are structural constraints, but we have distributed agency, and within that, communities have a capacity to respond to change and to try to negotiate their futures and negotiate some of the wider structures they sit within. In particular, some of my recent work has focused on thinking about the future in different ways. So we've done work through the Robust project with local government in Wales, articulating and co-producing a rural vision for Wales. And we've also done work for an Imagine project where we've tried to think about scenarios for territorial inequalities and spatial justice in 2050. And one of those scenarios we presented imagines a world which has been significantly impacted by climate change and the climate crisis, in which the geography of where is affluent and where is lagging in terms of regions has been fundamentally changed, in which there is large-scale migration as people are dispersed, and in which there are political consequences of that in terms of whether communities end up fighting each other or end up collaborating, cooperating to help each other adjust to change. And those questions do lead us to cross-disciplinary approaches in terms of understanding them, because we need to work together, as we've been doing with it, with different social scientists and politicians and economists to understand this alongside geographers and sociologists, but also to engage with natural and physical sciences in order to understand the drivers of those processes and think about technological solutions. And as Melia mentioned earlier on, to also particularly engage with arts and humanities and the potential there for thinking and reimagining the future in different ways. And that's why I'm very pleased to chair this panel this morning and look forward to hearing what our panelists have to say. We have three speakers. We have Dr. Hannah Hughes, who is a lecturer in international relations in Cardiff University, and we're talking about change with and for the climate. Dr. Nuen Chien is a research assistant in the Department of Physics in Aberystwyth University, who we're talking about climate risks. And Dr. Lucy Atala, who's a senior lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Wales, Trinity St David's, who will be talking about revitalizing water in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia. So I will hand over to Hannah to start. We'll hear from each of the speakers in turn, 10 minutes each, and then hopefully we'll have time for question and discussion after that. If you have questions which come to mind as you're listening to the speakers, please do put them into the chat and we can pick those up. But I'll also potentially open it up for people to come online and ask your questions live if you wish to do so later on. But before we do any of that, let me hand over and introduce Hannah. Hannah Hughes, as I mentioned, lecturer in international relations in the School of Law and Politics at Cardiff University, and interested in relations between knowledge and power in global environmental politics, and speaking this morning on the topic of change with and for the climate. Over to you, Hannah.
At present I'm a lecturer in international relations at Cardiff University, and then from mid-February I'm joining Aberystwyth University, and I'll be a senior lecturer in international politics and climate change. Okay, so I want to talk about a new project that I'm on research leave at the moment. I thought I might have a bit more time than I've had to devote to it, but I've had a book to finish. So basically, since COP23 in Bonn, I've been following the formation of the local communities and indigenous knowledge platform within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I didn't really know that I was going to be watching the formation of this. I've studied the IPCC for a long time, and I've been looking at structures, social, political, and economic structures and their reproduction. And I wanted to move on from looking at structures to looking at change and transformation of these. So I didn't know where to go when I got to COP23, and I was just watching the CCTV camera. And the thing that kept coming up that was open to observers was the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. So off I went and I started observing. Now, the interesting thing about, well, the platform is part of the Paris Agreement. It was established as an element of the Paris Agreement. And in COP22 in 2016, they decided to take an incremental approach, unsurprising there, so slowly building this platform. But what was most fascinating is that usually negotiations are between parties. Only states negotiate an intergovernmental text. But indigenous peoples insisted that they must and will only speak for themselves. They will represent themselves. And we saw movement here. And parties, when key decisions were being taken about this platform, gave the floor to indigenous representatives. So we saw a disruption to normal diplomatic practice. So these are some of the representatives from indigenous people alongside the delegates that were negotiating the platform. And it's essentially been established to strengthen the knowledge, technologies, practices and efforts of local communities, indigenous peoples related to addressing and responding to climate change, to facilitate the exchange of experience and the sharing of best practices and lessons learned on mitigation and adaptation in a holistic and integrated manner, and to enhance the engagement, essentially, of local communities and indigenous peoples in the UNFCCC process. And this, you know, has been a long struggle for indigenous peoples. They've been attending COPs, both within the climate regime and within biodiversity convention for many, many years. So we can consider it a site of struggle, of which there are several across international politics, seeking sovereign representation of their perspectives. And so this was considered making headway slowly. Let me try and here. So it has three functions: a knowledge function, a capacity for engagement, a climate change policies and actions. But I'm not going to dwell too much on the functions of the platform, because what was interesting for me was the questions that it raised around, could this encounter between indigenous peoples organizations and parties shape the culture of negotiations in the UNFCCC? So could it lead to change, essentially? How are delegates and indigenous representatives change through the experience? And that's the project that I want to build, because as I said, you know, I've been looking for a long time about the reproduction of social, political and economic structures through knowledge products within the IPCC. You know, Amelia talked about thought patterns. So there's both structures in the world and there's structures within our mind. And these are degrading the planet. And if we're going to respond to climate change and reverse and repair this degradation, then we have to change. We have to change institutionally. And I mean institutionally, both institutional structures in the world and institutionalized thought patterns. Okay. So this makes the platform a site of cultural change. That's why I'm interested in it. And also just because it's a fascinating place, a very special place within the UNFCCC, and to develop new research methodologies to shape how I undertake this research. But at the same time, I want to use myself as a site of change through this research. So both ethnography and autoethnography. And I feel that this is only fair to subject always other people to my observations. Shouldn't I also turn those observations back on myself and change and transform as I expect others to? So again, we're going to hear about the method of listening and storytelling. So telling stories to describe life worlds rather than extract material from them. And, you know, I really am just at the exploration stage of building and thinking about, or maybe not building, but deconstructing my methodology to do this. But what's important about this listening to stories for me is it enables recognition that you are in me and I am in you. So I didn't really understand life world, although I thought I did, until recently, when I began to go back over some of my memories from living in Japan. And I want to tell a little story about my time in Japan now, because it helps this to show where this interest has come from in cultural experiences and socialization, but also how I've come to understand what the life world is. So I'm just going to stop sharing there because I need to read my story. So I've always struggled to be socialized. I'm sure many of you will share in this. My mother tried hard to get me to bend to the rules, to how I was supposed to be, but somehow I just couldn't get myself to abide by them. You might say that I was unruly. That's not to say that I am or ever was unsocialized. That's impossible. I was brought up as a British citizen, and that conditions my thinking. I just wasn't able to confine myself to the social location and its embodiment that I was born into. When I first moved to Japan, I remember being quite offended by all the jokes and associations that Japanese people have about British people and fish and chips. I didn't understand cultural stereotyping until that moment, when I was typified and felt the need to defend my culture rise up inside of me, until at some point that response wasn't there anymore. I lived 3 years in Japan, and there were certain moments that I realized I was undergoing a new process of socialization or acculturation. The first was when I had been there nearly a year. I was in the bathroom and looked up in the mirror, and I was so surprised at the person that reflected back at me. I wasn't Japanese. I didn't look like the people around me. That sense of surprise has never left me. The second moment was when I was in a dinner with foreigners like myself in a Japanese restaurant, an izakaya. I had been there over 2 years by that point, and I was proud how I'd learned some of the important etiquette along with the language of Japanese society. Public mealtimes might be seen as a dance of social grace, and I enjoyed that, the rhythm and orderliness. Westerners seemed so big and clumsy in contrast. So when a friend who hadn't been there long went to pour her own glass instead of another's first, I rebuked her. I still feel sad at that action now, but it was an important lesson, because in that moment, I realized how socialization brutalizes the human being inside. That is when the process of seeing how I had been brutalized, sculpted, scarred, and dented by my own attempts to confine myself to the social rules really began, the unraveling. The third moment was when I was back in my own hometown. I'm not sure now whether this memory is from a short holiday or if I had moved back. I was walking down the high street of the local town, and I have never felt so out of place in my life. It was as if everything that was so familiar was so alien. I couldn't take it for granted and not think or see it like I had before. I was present in it and completely separate from it, until again at some point I no longer was. So all this to tell you why I think perhaps I'm so interested in the process of acculturation. Socialization, learning and doing the rules of a society changes us, and we can undergo this change again when we move between societies. Even a short encounter can change us, provide a reflection point to look back at ourselves and our ways of being, open space for questioning and perhaps even discontinuing something that has seemed so naturally part of us until it isn't. The space created is short-lived, momentary. It needs to be used or it is lost. These two elements, meeting social difference and reflecting whole possibilities for change and transformation, which are critical at this moment in history. And we need to do more to bring them into the open and use them for the opportunity that they are. And so this is why I want to combine these as a methodology for exploring sites, the site of the Indigenous Knowledge Platform and the site of myself, exploring the transformation in a well-structured culture of the UNFCCC, as well as the changes in my own understandings, my own life world through that study. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That is fascinating, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and discussion around that later on, because certainly there's methodologically, I think, and ethically, you raised lots of interesting questions which will touch many people. We'll move on, though, to our second speaker, who is Dr. Nuen Chien, who is a research assistant in the Department of Physics at Aberystwyth University. And Nuen is going to be speaking on the title of Climate Risks.
So my topic is about climate risk. And why I choose this topic, because it's very relevant to the UK as well, as in many countries where we see that due to climate change and there is an inherent threat to the society. During my period of research in Aberystwyth, I'm doing some data analysis for a contract here, but I'm very interested in this investigating the risk of coastal erosion in a local Inequality beach, which is 10 kilometers away from Aberystwyth. We know that Aberystwyth had a very severe storm in 2014, and then it heavily damaged the promenade of the town. So one of the natural questions is that is that such a big severe event would affect the beach of Inequality. You can see some images of the local beach, and then there's some scar here due to very mild wave, but we would expect that it will be some more severe erosion. So the project has just started, and instead of this particular one, I would like to discuss with you a bit on the climate risk in general only, more like a literature review of the problem. So we discuss some of the typical climate risk and the compound risk in here, which is very relevant to the UK and other developed countries. And so let's first delve with the concept of the climate risk. As IPCC has defined, the risk can be perceived as the potential loss of life, injury, or destroyed or damage of assets that could occur to a system, society, or community in a specific period of time. So it's about an event which is yet to happen, and it's for that reason, it's very hard to predict and to estimate the risk quantitatively. However, we all agree that it can be seen as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. with an uncertain outcome. So the formula would be a product of probability of the events and the consequence, of which the consequence is a function of the intensity of the hazard, the exposure and the vulnerability of the society, and even some authors may argue that instead of this multiplication, they use the convolution operator. So it's a kind of that they concern the time series evolution of the event rather than its only magnitude. So by doing convolution, then they can kind of integrate between the probability and consequences in a more realistic way. Okay, so anyhow, there's typical climate-related hazards that I list here. We can understand the hazard as the physical events, and the climatic drivers are associated with these events. The drivers are the physical phenomena. Although we list them as climatic drivers, but actually they can incorporate the weather events as well, as we want to focus on short-term but very extreme events. So we have storms driven by the wind speed and the atmospheric pressure, the coastal flood by the water level of the sea and the wind causing that flood, and also potentially some of the discharge from the river upstream if the coast here is near the river mouth. And then we have a river flood due to precipitation, due to the discharge of the streams upstream. And then we can have concurrent wind and precipitation. We have drought. We can have heat stress caused by temperature and relative humidity. We can have a concurrent drought and heat. We can have fire risk, which may be very hazardous to forests as well. And this can depend on the lightning event. And we have concurrent heat and air pollution, which affects our urbans. And this depends also on the air quality, such as particulate matters on our atmosphere. So in this list, we can see that there are compound events, compound hazards with literally the joint occurrence of two types or more events, hazards. So these compound events is made very disastrous, and I would point out an example that is a coastal flooding hazard. Compound hazards can cause much greater risk than independent events. Yet it is difficult to estimate. As you see that it can be caused by the storm tides and waves, and also precipitation and the river discharge. And when these factors combine, then the uncertainty adds up, and it's very hard to predict accurately. In the UK, we have different sites, and they have the research for particular sites and for particular events in the past, and then they have kind of making a risk map for the different locals. Yeah. Yes. Still, it's very hard to persuade that these results are very predictive in the future. Yes. You know the difficulty. So to tackle this, some of the authors in the US conduct a study on the statistical point of view, they consider not one but two climate drivers simultaneously, climate driver 1 and 2, and then we have the magnitude of this, and then they make a joint plot between these two factors. So they list the present scenario, the future one, the future two scenarios. The present scenarios concern the compound event, but with no projection. That is, if the condition is like present, that we have this kind of hazard, and the hazard is confined in this green line, which is green contours, which is more like a bell shape. It's 3D, but here we flatten to the contour, like this bell shape. But if they project to a less favorable, more severe scenarios, and the distribution will be lengthened and reaching the high hazard zones. Yeah, so from this example, they conclude that if we consider the compound hazard with different types of distribution of this climate, and with the accounting for the more severe cases, then the hazard would be higher than these normal scenarios. Next comes the social factors. As we see that the apart from the natural factor, we also have to consider the human exposure and the vulnerability data, which is more difficult because it's more subjective, and it's very hard to quantify it. And in my experience, some of the survey in the past, when we did some interview, or the local people, they might tend to overestimate the damages, and it's very hard to incorporate that information into the assessment of the risk. And also these are for past event and may not reflect future values. So there's no universal solutions. Yet the UK, we have the flood and coastal erosion risk management, this handbook, and this manual covers practical cases in the UK. But I would think that we can take advantage of the UK's excellent data platform and digital government infrastructure to develop some further studies and practical guidelines for this risk assessment. And there has been some framework given by the Swiss research group, which I will list in the reference by the end of this presentation. And then apart from these climatic drivers, they have list these non-climatic drivers from the social aspects. So we can see that the risk is in the center of this chart, combining all the three factors of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. And this will take into account of the people's development as well. One of the difficult problems is to make a risk map, because here I show you the example of the US case that they estimate the risk for different locations. Yes, but if we are to devise a map, a continuous map that can be made in a grid to be supported, to be supplied into the models to make decision-making processes that will be more difficult because we cannot simply interpolate it between these discrete points. And that is also one problem we have to think about it. Also, when we take into the account of the human factors, there are complex risks. Besides the compound events, we have interacting risk, interconnected risk, and cascading risk. And this relates to different dimensions of human development, and it will happen in a chain and not simultaneously. And but this risk causes one another, so it's more difficult to assess in detail this kind of complex risk. And so I would think there are still many problems in estimating this compound risk and complex risk. I used some materials from these review articles, and I think that it's very useful if you can have a read on this, because it reviews international cases as well as the UK. And with that, I would like to thank you and for following me in this talk.
Thank you very much, Nuen. I think you provide a very good summary of some of the risks and the challenges of understanding the compound nature of those risks. And we might be able to pick up some discussion around that in questions later. But we'll move on now to the third presentation, which is from Lucy Atala, who's a senior lecturer in anthropology at the University of Wales, Trinity St David's. Lucy's work is particularly focused around issues around the cultural meanings of water in different locations, and that's what she's going to be speaking about this morning, which, as you can see on the screen, is around revitalizing water in this area of Nevada de Santa Maria with the Koji people. So Lucy, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So this talk really just provides a very brief overview of a project that's just getting on its feet. So it's in its pilot stages. It's a collaborative venture and it's a UNESCO endorsed project. There's another member of the team in the audience actually, so we could draw on them later just to shock them with that. So this is concerned with revitalizing water, as it says, in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which is in Colombia, with a group called the Kogi, who are one of 4 indigenous groups who live in the area. The title then translates as something like "Let It Be Reborn" or "Let It Be Born," which advertises something of the project's overarching understanding, namely facilitating regeneration and flourishing. And so that's what it's concerned with. I'm a social anthropologist, and as far as I could make out, what Hannah was suggesting is what anthropologists are trained to do and do exclusively all the time. That is, reflect on their own practice and notice that there are different situations and knowledge is situated and positional. But there we are. Do an anthropology course, Hannah. Come and join us. I feel like almost the only one in Wales. Anyway, my fieldwork experience is in different areas, as the slide says, but is concerned specifically with human relationships with worldly substances. I've focused on water, and I'm continuing to focus on water, but I also look at other substances like the soil and plastics as well. So I go all over the place. All right, the local context then of this research is, as I've already said, in Colombia. It's the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta is one of the highest coastal mountain massifs in the world, and it holds immense environmental diversity and has really important cultural and historical legacies. It's now recognized by Colombian legislation as the ancestral territories of 4 different indigenous groups, one of which is the Kogi. The Kogi, working from the their principles of life, the laws of life's origin, understand the world as a living body that supports and that needs support, and that through correct action can function. So they describe the landscape as a fabric connected by energy nodes or sacred sites that through fundamental forces need to be maintained if planetary health can be maintained. So water, obviously vital for everything to flourish, is generated by the mothers of water who reside in the higher lagoons of the region. But multiple local factors, events such as mining and agricultural practices and the restricted access to certain areas, have altered the fabric of that territory and therefore the way that water can behave. So despite working to sustain the territory's health, the Kogi explain that they are increasingly struggling and have been increasingly struggling actually since the 90s to work effectively. They say this is not simply because of local factors. This is because a wider issues that they recognize, namely the deepening damage brought about by the harmful and destructive practices of industrialization around the world and the concomitant climate changes that those actions have generated, as well as, coupled with then a general disregard for indigenous conservation strategies. So, put another way, if you like, the valorization and the dominance of certain practices over others and certain knowledge systems over others. So consequently, the initial incentive and the impetus to create this project comes directly from the Kogi. The Kogi, who approached a UK-based NGO called the Tairona Heritage Trust that I'm part of, and you can see some members of the group in the photograph there. They came together so that this project could be co-created. The project extends a relationship that's already well established with the Tairona Heritage Trust, but it continues to invert those typical power dynamics that we see imposed upon the world. Those typical power dynamics and expected knowledge hierarchies are inverted to an extent, an important extent, in that the Kogi actively steer and shape and determine the purpose and the direction of the project. So while we are partners, their voices are loud in how the territory needs to be approached and how the aims and the objectives of the project can be enacted. So the objective of this UNESCO's Bridges endorsed project, sort of the overall goal, I suppose, is to record and disseminate a model of ecological restoration based on indigenous methodologies. So that's going to be achieved by recording changes in collaboration. That's through facilitating observation and dialogue between Kogi ecological specialists. So the Kogi ecological specialists are called mamas. So between the mamas and what we might consider to be orthodox scientific conservation practitioners, such as environmental scientists and ecologists, of a team that we are kind of collecting. So the objective then is to determine how degradation can be reversed, how dried up springs can be revived, and how flora and fauna recover using Kogi methods alongside or together with those of the hard sciences. So this is to work together in collaboration to bring alternative knowledge and new methods to the world's attention at a time when, I would argue, the methods that we currently use are part of the destructive mindset that have got us into the trouble we are currently suffering. So the idea then is to define and to realize synergies, not to imagine one method is better than the other necessarily, but to find places of synergy, to evaluate approaches again, and to potentially work towards bridging a gap between these different knowledge systems that seem to be ontologically clashing on each other. So there's the core partnership that I've already mentioned of the COGI through their organization called OGT, Organisation Ogonawindura Tairona, and the Tairona Heritage Trust. So one organization in Colombia, one in the UK, and one is run by COGI, one is run by a group of academics and others, along with other partners that you can see mentioned on the slide there, providing academic input at different points in the project. So the work obviously requires a much wider group of academic experts and assessors and administrators and advisors and managers and so on, and they've all been brought in, but in concert with the guidance of OGT and the COGI. So this is not a project that is focused through Euro-American or academic minds, but rather in deep consultation with what the COGI say needs to be done. And so these individuals at various points, sitting in various roles, will accompany the COGI in this restoration work to see what happens. So the methods then are transdisciplinary. It's a mixed methods approach, and we're just starting off with at the beginning of a 3-year pilot phase with results anticipated in about 10 years. We're drawing on multiple methods from different disciplines to measure, collect, analyze, and disseminate information. So, things such as, but not limited to, GIS mapping and soil sampling, but also participant observation, informal interviews, photography, art, and so on. And all of that, we're going to start off initially to create a baseline, and then after that to document and to record the restoration of a parcel of land that has been chosen by the COGI and has been purchased specifically for the purpose. So that piece of land is considered to be dying in association with local and global changes to the climate. So as I've said, it's established, we've got a first phase that's now established of these 3 years, and with results anticipated in 10. And the dissemination methods we hope to create will include those typical conference papers and articles, but we're also keen to create educational materials for schools at all ages to advertise these different methods of approaching the environment, ecological damage, the notion of ecology, and how the world works through these shared mindsets. But we'll also create an active online presence that will provide information at different phases throughout the project. So I've kept beautifully to time, she said, well, so finally then, this project is the UNESCO Bridges endorsed transdisciplinary collaborative project, which aims at revitalizing water with the COGI, an indigenous group living in Colombia. The objective of this project is to determine, how environmental degradation can be reversed using these alternative methods, and aims to record them and produce educational material to disseminate. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And yes, you have kept beautifully to time. So we have got.
Academics are shameless in their.
Yep. But yeah, we've got so much we want to say, and I think that we have.
But nobody's more important than anybody else.
No, not indeed. So and I think we've got lots we want to say, but we also have lots we want to ask and to listen to. So we have got time now for some questions. I'm going to go back. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. We've got a question first to Hannah from Ambrina, who asks how far your way of thinking is linked to your living in your home and working, living in your home and work multilingually.
Well, I mean, we could think of disciplines as languages too. Each discipline has like a specific language and way of talking and way of thinking. So, learning a language is a far more intense form, like traveling to Japan is a far more intense form of this space to reflect on living between cultures, living between socialization processes. But I think disciplines also offer a great opportunity to see how our thinking is being shaped and changed. I don't know if that answers your question, Brina.
I think that's an interesting response. And I do think it's something we can bring distinctively from Wales to a lot of these questions, that we are familiar in working with, at least in working in a bilingual environment and living it, and some of us being bilingual. And I think that offers us perhaps an insight in terms of how we approach these issues on a bigger scale, which is interesting to reflect upon. I have a couple of questions here for Lucy. That firstly, a very specific practical question of whether there's a way to sign up for updates on this project from Jennifer, and then a question from Siobhan on whether you see this project as representative of a wider transition and in research on and restoration of environmental challenges.
Yes, thank you both for your questions. I think if you want updates, then if you join the Tairona Heritage Trust, which you just have to write into Google, you will get constant updates from the trust who are part of focusing this. And so you can do it that way, but equally we've got a Facebook page and so on. So please join. The second question was, do I see this as potentially something wider than just located on that piece of land or that area of Colombia? Absolutely, yes. I mean, this is why I find this project so very, very exciting, is that it potentially will be transferable. So no, it's not just learning about how that happened in that area, but possibly a model that can be used in other areas too, or can be adapted for use in other areas too. And that's why I think this is actually really globally significant. I mean, I don't want to trumpet too loud because that sounds a bit silly, but look, Falk, who is actually the other member of the team that I'm working with, who's in the audience now. I mean, is Falk allowed to talk? Can Falk talk? Falk, do you want to join in? Do you
Hello.
Do you want to add anything?
No, I think that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Lucy. Yes, we are currently in the first phase of that pilot project, where we will work together with the Kogi to identify pieces of land to be restored and initiate the knowledge exchange over the next couple of months. And based on that, we will continue developing the project. And as I was saying, we hope to also develop a website in a way to keep people more up to date on this project. But until then, we would be very, very happy if you can check the website and the Facebook site.
Brilliant. Thanks, Falk. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you both for that. I've got a question for Nuen, and then I'm going to come back to Jennifer who wants to ask a question verbally. But Nuen, again, very interested in your talk. I was wondering about whether there is scope for citizen science in addressing these projects. And obviously, some of what you're talking about is using large databases and modeling with that. But is there opportunity perhaps for citizen science of collecting data which can feed into addressing these challenges, or of being trained in thinking about how to assess risks themselves?
Oh, sorry, the question addressed to me?
Yes, a question to you. So so is there a role of citizen science in looking at climate risks? And so we talked a bit about large data, but is there a role perhaps for communities to collect data through citizen science and to think about understanding those risks themselves?
Yes, thank you. Yes, actually, it's a big chance for us to promote the use of big data and also participation from the public. As we see, we have a smartphone here, and we can kind of input the data from the public to the main system, so that we, for example, for surveys, we can provide the feedback from the community, and then the system will make that for making to integrate it into the system. Let me take an example. If we want to assess the damage from the flood, we in case we don't have enough information to do surveys in time, then the local people are the people who knows the damage most closely, and then they will provide information. And then with the GPS associated with the smartphones, they can make a map of the damage in real time. And it would be better to use that information rather than relying on the satellite data images, for example. In Scotland, there's ongoing project on the fourth era, and the fourth or fifth, the estuary running through Dundee. Yeah, and then they do that kind of participatory environmental monitoring.
Excellent, thank you. That's a great example again of co-disciplinary approaches to these problems. And using citizen science and those skills is certainly one way of doing that. So thank you, Nuen, for that. We have time for one final question, and I'm going to ask Jennifer if you could unmute yourself and put that question, I think both to Lucy and Hannah it is.
Yeah, thanks. I couldn't figure out how to type it. You've both been working with or looking at other cultures and people who are very, using my approach or writing it, very different. What's your advice based on what you've learned about kind of crossing cultural boundaries, colour boundaries, to other people moving into those areas? I've started a collaboration with Nigeria, and it's been, I knew the cultural kind of clash would be a challenge, and it has been a challenge. And I'm struggling to know how to negotiate that. So have you got any kind of broad spectrum advice for, you know, and obviously staying away from white Western imperialism?
Yeah. Hannah, do you want to respond, or shall I? Okay,
you start, Lucy, and then we'll come to Hannah.
It's very difficult to give you advice, you know, broad sweep. Obviously, cultural sensitivity is important, but an anthropologist spends a lot of time in other countries being with people so that they are taught by those people. So the typical power dynamic is always inverted in anthropology. The anthropologist is not the expert, other than being an expert learner. The anthropologist sits there and is grateful to be taught, and so therefore kind of can't step on people's toes in the same way that somebody else who rages in thinking, or even just walks in politely actually and says, you know, I'm the expert, I want to know these things, I want to do this in your world, I want to do this to your country, I want to do this to your family, to your people, to your healthcare system, to all these kind of things. You really need to learn from us. The anthropologist never does that. That's antithesis of the methodology of anthropology. The role of an anthropologist is a humble one, is a one where you say, I don't know anything about your world. Would you please help me to understand? And could you teach me? And that's when you recognize how much bullshit you're full of. That's when you recognize how much of your own knowledge is situated in a system, and how much you're socialized and acculturated and all of those different things that mean that you see the world in a particular way. And that's why anthropologists spend a lot of time really struggling to ensure that they don't do damage to other people by when they write about them, or when they, produce their, research findings, because they want to make sure that the people who have been kind enough to allow you into their world are co-authors, have editorial control, have been accurately represented, have not had their worldview, sort of looked at under a microscope and inspected as if they're some sort of strange creature from another planet, or, a species of some kind. And, all of these, all of the methods of doing research and of knowledge production are challenged by anthropology, because it doesn't do those things. So that's not a short answer, and I'm so sorry.
Anna.
Yeah, I mean, I can't give you maybe disciplinary advice, but I could give you advice from human to human, someone who's navigated these things across a few cultures. I mean, there are things that will make you feel uncomfortable. There are things that will make you judge without you even wanting to judge. The judgment is there. And I think it's a process of learning why things actually make you feel a particular way, make you feel uncomfortable. And if you kind of, this is what I was trying to say, if you yourself become a site as well as that site that you're studying, if you look back on how these things are making you feel, I think that does help you soften your interaction with the other culture. At least that's been my experience. And you make mistakes. You make lots of mistakes. You say the wrong words, you're insensitive, and without even realizing it. And also you have to allow that to, like, making mistakes and then, trying again a different way.
And that reflects, sorry, I've just got one more thing to say, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that reflexive, so that's not reflection, that's reflexivity, that reflexive process is a really important part of fieldwork methods. And actually is something that everybody should be doing, is reflecting on who they are and why they think they're saying what they say, why they think they know what they think they know. Everyone, always.
Absolutely. I think that takes us back, I think, neatly to Melia's talk in many ways of thinking about this. So thank you both, and also to Nuen. I think there's some great insights there. And I think we're getting into an area here which I think probably deserves an event in its own, of talking about some of those things. But also I think the benefits of a network like of sharing those experiences and approaches, and a co-disciplinary approach, which is not just about fueling together different literatures or skills, but actually learning from each other's disciplines, and also thinking about how we use those to extend and involve those beyond academia. So thank you for some great contributions this morning. I'm going to hand back over to Martin.